In the summer of 2025, a small team of archaeologists knelt in the dust of a quiet farming village called Lingbao in China's Henan province, carefully lifting a set of brittle human teeth out of a burial pit that had not been opened in roughly 6,200 years. They packed the teeth in sterile containers, drove them to a clean lab at Fudan University in Shanghai, and began a process that would eventually connect the bones of a Stone Age farmer to the blood of more than 1 billion people alive today. Nobody in that lab was digging for treasure. They were not looking for gold or jade or a lost tomb full of artifacts. They were hunting for something far smaller and far more revealing. Fragments of ancient DNA locked inside a dental pulp, waiting 7 millennia to tell a story nobody had been able to prove before. What they found, published only weeks later in the journal National Science Review, would confirm one of the most extraordinary claims in the history of population genetics, that the people living along the Middle Yellow River today are the direct, unbroken genetic descendants of farmers who tilled that same soil more than 6,000 years ago. Before we go further, understand what is actually at stake here. This is not a minor academic footnote. This is a genetic paper trail connecting a living population of over 1 billion people back to a single Stone Age homeland, a level of continuity that has almost no equal anywhere else on the planet. And to understand why that is so shocking, you first need to understand what usually happens to ancient populations over thousands of years. They vanish. They get invaded, replaced, absorbed, or wiped out. Entire bloodlines disappear from the historical record within a few centuries. So when scientists tell you a population has survived largely intact for 7,000 years, through famine, war, and conquest after conquest, that is not a small claim. That is one of the most unusual findings in the study of human history. The team behind the discovery was led by geneticist Wang Chuanchao of Fudan University, working alongside archaeologists from the Henan Provincial Institute of Cultural Heritage and Archaeology and researchers from Yangshao University. Together, they sequenced 112 high-quality ancient genomes pulled from 8 archaeological sites scattered across the Middle Yellow River, spanning an almost unbroken timeline from roughly 6,200 years ago up to just a century ago. Some of the oldest genetic material came from a site called Xiaowu, near Lingbao, and those samples rank among the earliest Yangshao-related genomes ever recovered from that stretch of the river. The Yangshao culture itself is not a household name outside of China, but inside the world of archaeology, it is treated with the same reverence that Egyptologists reserve for the Old Kingdom. First identified in 1921 at a village also called Yangshao in Manchu County, this culture flourished across the Yellow River Basin, somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, and it remains the most widely distributed Neolithic culture ever found in China. Its people built round pit houses clustered into organized villages. They painted intricate red and black geometric patterns onto their pottery. And they carved early symbols into bone and tortoiseshell that many scholars view as a distant ancestor of Chinese writing. They domesticated foxtail millet and broomcorn millet as their staple crops. An agricultural system developed completely independently from the wheat and barley being farmed at the very same moment on the other side of the world in the Fertile Crescent. Nobody taught them how to farm. Nobody handed them a system of symbols. They built it themselves out of the mud and grain of their own river valley. Before the Yangshao discovery, there was already a long buildup of research pointing in this direction, and it helps to understand how any of this is even possible. DNA works something like a clock. Every generation, small mutations accumulate inside the genome, tiny changes that get passed down from parent to child. When one population splits into 2 separate groups, and those groups stop interbreeding, their genetic codes slowly begin to drift apart from each other, and the longer that separation lasts, the wider the gap grows. This is the exact mechanism that allows geneticists to look at a DNA sample today and estimate how closely, or how distantly, it relates to a sample recovered from a burial site thousands of years old. Every population on Earth outside of Africa traces its deep roots back to a wave of human migration that left the African continent somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago, spreading first across Asia, then into Europe, and eventually into the Americas. As those early travelers moved into new environments, adapting to new climates and new food sources, their DNA slowly changed to fit their surroundings, branching into the thousands of distinct regional populations recognized around the world today. Chinese population geneticists, including teams based at Fudan University's Human Phenome Institute, spent years building reference databases of modern DNA collected from across every province before they ever had ancient genomes to test the deeper question directly. What they noticed early on was unusual. Despite China's enormous size and geographic diversity, the underlying genetic variation across the country was surprisingly limited for a landmass that large. That kind of pattern usually points toward one explanation: a single founding population that expanded quickly and thoroughly, rather than many separate populations mixing together from different directions. But that pattern alone could not prove where the founding population came from or how far back its roots extended. For that, researchers needed genetic material recovered directly from the ground, from skeletons old enough to test the theory against the real historical record. That is exactly what the Lingbao excavation and the broader Yangshao genome project connected to it finally delivered. For decades, archaeologists suspected that this Yellow River culture was somehow connected to the people living in the same region today. But suspicion is not proof. Pottery styles can spread through trade. Farming techniques can spread through cultural contact, even without a single person migrating anywhere. What archaeology alone could never settle was the biological question: are today's Henan farmers the actual flesh and blood descendants of the Yangshao people, or did later migrations quietly replace the original population while leaving the pottery styles and place names behind? That is the exact question ancient DNA was built to answer, because unlike pottery or writing, DNA cannot be copied or borrowed. It can only be inherited. Every time a population fully replaces another, the genetic signature changes, sometimes dramatically, within just a handful of generations. Scientists have watched this exact pattern play out across Europe, where DNA drawn from Bronze Age skeletons in Britain shows that within just a few centuries of a new cultural group arriving from the continent, close to 90% of the existing local population's genetic signature had been replaced. That is how fast a population can be erased when a large enough wave of newcomers arrives. So when the Fudan team compared their ancient Yellow River genomes against the DNA of people living in the exact same region today, this was the real test. Would the region show a similar pattern of replacement, layer after layer of unrelated populations stacked on top of each other the way you see in so much of Europe? Or would something else appear? What they found instead was continuity almost too clean to believe. The genetic markers recovered from remains dating back over 6,000 years lined up strikingly well with the DNA of people living in the same stretch of Henan province today. This was not a faint echo or a loose family resemblance buried under thousands of years of mixing. Researchers could trace direct ancestral lines connecting specific ancient burial sites to specific present-day communities, essentially watching one lineage hold its ground across 60 centuries while empires rose and fell around it. And this was not an isolated case. It fits into a much larger body of genetic research on Chinese population history that has been building for years. And the deeper you go into that research, the stranger and more compelling the overall picture becomes. Take, for instance, a separate study focused specifically on the lower reaches of the Yellow River in Shandong province, again involving researchers from Fudan University, this time reaching back to the Han Dynasty, a period that began more than 2,000 years ago. That study examined genomes spanning the Dawenku culture, the Longshan culture, and eventually the historical Han Dynasty period itself, and it found that the genetic contribution from the original Yellow River populations ranged from roughly 20% all the way up to a full 100% in different samples, depending on the specific site and time period, but the underlying Yellow River genetic signal never disappeared. It persisted, generation after generation, through the rise and fall of entire dynasties. Researchers also found that populations associated with the Longshan and Dawenku cultures in Shandong were genetically closer to the broader Yellow River Basin population than to any outside group, reinforcing the idea of a coherent, long-lasting genetic community anchored to this one river system stretching back thousands of years. Now here is where the story becomes even more interesting, because Yellow River ancestry did not just sit still in its original homeland, it expanded. Scientists studying the lower Yangtze River Basin, hundreds of kilometers to the south, examined ancient remains spanning from the Song Dynasty through the Qing Dynasty, a period covering roughly the last 1,000 years, and found that 7 individuals in their sample derived somewhere between 69 and 100% of their ancestry from populations related to the ancient Yellow River farmers, with the remaining portion tracing back to an older southern genetic substrate connected to the region's original rice farming communities. In other words, modern people living along the lower Yangtze today can be modeled as the direct genetic descendants of people who were already living in that exact same area centuries ago, a population shaped by wave after wave of southward expansion from the Yellow River core, blending with, but never fully erasing, the earlier rice farming societies who had already been cultivating that land for thousands of years before the northern farmers arrived. Interestingly, one single sample from the Qing Dynasty period even revealed an unexpected genetic link stretching all the way to the eastern Mediterranean, a small but fascinating reminder that even a genetically stable region was never completely sealed off from the wider world, just remarkably resistant to being overwritten by it. The pattern keeps repeating as researchers push further into China's more remote and mountainous regions. A recent study on the Qiang people, an ethnic minority group considered by many geneticists to represent one of the deepest layers of the entire Chinese gene pool, sequenced 20 deep coverage Qiang genomes, compared them against more than 1,100 high-coverage genomes from 33 different East Asian populations, plus hundreds more from global reference panels. Using roughly 450 ancient Asian genomes as a comparative backbone, the researchers traced the most recent common ancestor of the Qiang people back to ancient Yellow River farmers who lived approximately 5,300 years ago, confirming that even populations living deep in the mountains of western China, far from the original river valley, share a common root system with the broader Han Chinese population. But the Qiang story also reveals something else, the power of local adaptation layered on top of ancient ancestry. Researchers identified a highly prevalent genetic variant in a gene connected to blood pressure regulation among certain Qiang subpopulations, a variant that appears to be tied to survival at higher elevations, alongside other differentiated genetic markers connected to alcohol metabolism and skin pigmentation. This is exactly the kind of layered genetic history that keeps showing up across China, one deep ancestral trunk from the Yellow River, with distinct regional branches shaped by climate, altitude, and thousands of years of local selection. That same theme of altitude-driven adaptation becomes even more dramatic once you look toward the Tibetan Plateau. When Yellow River-related populations pushed westward into the high mountains of what is now Sichuan and onto the Tibetan Plateau itself, they encountered a landscape that could kill an unadapted human body simply by existing in it. At elevations above 4,000 meters, oxygen levels dropped low enough to cause serious health problems for people without genetic adaptations. Yet Tibetan populations today carry a specific genetic variant connected to efficient oxygen processing at high altitude in roughly 80% of the population, a variant that is almost completely absent among lowland Chinese populations. That variant almost certainly did not evolve inside the Yellow River population itself. Over the incredibly short span of human history since farmers began moving into Tibet. Instead, the leading explanation among geneticists is that incoming farmers intermarried with populations who were already living at altitude and who had developed that adaptation over a much longer stretch of time, absorbing the trait into their own bloodline as they settled the plateau. Without that borrowed adaptation, the westward expansion of Yellow River farmers into one of the most extreme environments on Earth might never have succeeded in the first place. So by this point, you might be asking the obvious question. If this Yellow River population expanded so successfully in every direction, north, south, and west, absorbing local groups as it went, why did it never get overwritten the same way so many other ancient populations were? Especially considering how many times China itself was conquered by outside forces? This is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because China endured some of the most dramatic military conquests in human history, and yet the underlying genetic picture barely moved. Take the Mongol conquest of the 13th century, one of the largest and most brutal military campaigns the world has ever seen, a conquest that eventually controlled the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Mongols ruled over China for close to a century under the Yuan dynasty, and yet, when geneticists search for Mongol ancestry inside modern northern Chinese populations today, the trace that shows up typically sits below 2%. A conquest that reshaped the map of Asia left almost no lasting mark on the DNA of the people it ruled over. The same pattern shows up again with the Manchu conquest of the 17th century, which established the Qing dynasty and controlled China for roughly 270 years. Qing rulers initially tried to keep Manchu and Han populations administratively and even genetically separate, maintaining distinct registration systems and, in some cases, discouraging intermarriage. It did not work. Intermarriage happened anyway, especially among elite families navigating imperial politics, and by the final decades of the dynasty, most families officially classified as Manchu carried substantial Han Chinese ancestry, their genetic and even cultural identity gradually folding into the much larger population around them. Compare that to what happened across large parts of Europe over a similar span of time, and the contrast becomes almost jarring. Genetic studies of Bronze Age Europe reveal repeated waves of steppe pastoralist migration beginning around 5,000 years ago. Migrations that, in some regions, replaced up to 90% of the existing local population within just a handful of generations, an almost total genetic turnover compressed into a shockingly short window of time. Ancient DNA from Bronze Age. Britain shows this kind of rapid, sweeping replacement happening on the ground in real time. Entire regional populations essentially swapped out as new cultural groups arrived. Modern European populations, geneticists often note, are best understood as layered composites, populations from different historical waves stacked on top of one another like sediment. China's story, at least across the Yellow River heartland, reads almost like the opposite, less a stack of replacements and more a single deep root system that kept growing outward without ever being pulled up. Why did it play out this way? Geneticists and archaeologists studying this question generally point to a combination of factors working together rather than any single cause. Geography is one obvious piece of the puzzle. The Yellow River Basin sits inside a kind of natural fortress, with the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau forming a nearly impassable barrier to the southwest, the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts blocking easy large-scale migration from the northwest, and rugged mountain ranges complicating movement from the southwest as well. None of these barriers made China impossible to invade. History obviously proves that wrong, but they did slow migration down enough and funnel it through specific river valleys and lowland corridors that any outside group arriving in the heartland had usually already mixed genetically with northern populations somewhere along the way before ever reaching the core. Agriculture adds another layer to the explanation. Millet farming in the north and rice farming in the south supported dense, stable, well-fed populations, and dense populations are simply much harder to displace than sparse ones. During the Bronze Age, the Yellow River Basin is estimated to have supported something in the range of 100 people per square kilometer in its most productive areas, compared to only 1 or 2 people per square kilometer across the vast steppe regions to the north. When that kind of population imbalance exists, even a successful military conquest rarely translates into genetic replacement, because there are simply never enough invaders to outnumber the people already living there. Then there's culture. And this may be the most powerful factor of all. Chinese civilization developed an unusually durable written language, one that stayed visually and structurally consistent, even as spoken dialects across the country drifted apart over the centuries, into forms that were often mutually unintelligible when spoken aloud. Someone from the far north and someone from the deep south might not understand a single word of each other's speech, yet they could read and write the exact same characters, creating a shared literate culture that reinforced a common identity, generation after generation. Combine that with a long-running imperial examination system that selected officials based on mastery of classical texts, and you create a powerful incentive. If outside rulers wanted lasting political power, they had to learn the language and effectively become culturally Chinese themselves. Mongol and later Manchu elites who wanted genuine authority married into local families, educated their children in the classical tradition, and within a handful of generations, whatever separate identity they arrived with had largely dissolved into the surrounding population, culturally and genetically both. Put those three forces together, protective geography, a dense agricultural population base, and a self-reinforcing cultural and linguistic system, and you get something that is genuinely rare in world history, a population that could absorb newcomers, survive conquest after conquest, and endure repeated cycles of political division and reunification, all without ever experiencing the kind of sweeping genetic replacement that reshaped so much of Europe and other parts of the ancient world. That resilience shows up clearly in the regional genetic patterns researchers have mapped across the country today. Populations sampled from Henan and neighboring provinces, sitting right in the historical Yellow River heartland, tend to show the strongest, most direct genetic link back to the original Yangshao-related founders. Move south into the Yangtze Basin, and researchers find a clear blend, a strong Yellow River foundation layered together with meaningful ancestry from the region's original rice farming populations, a genetic gradient that grows stronger the closer you get to the historical southern heartlands of rice cultivation. Move west toward Sichuan and the Tibetan frontier, and you find yet another distinct blend, Yellow River ancestry, combined with genetic contributions from highland populations who had already adapted to that extreme environment long before farmers arrived. And yet in every single region researchers have examined, one thing stays constant. Yellow River ancestry consistently forms the dominant underlying layer that every regional variation gets built on top of. What makes all of this more than just an interesting footnote in a genetics journal is what it reveals about the deeper structure of human history itself. For a long time, a certain school of historical thinking assumed that advanced, complex civilizations could only ever emerge in a small handful of privileged locations, places like the Fertile Crescent or the Nile Valley, and that everywhere else, farming, writing, and complex society must have spread outward from those original centers through trade, migration, or conquest. China never fit neatly into that framework. Its writing system does not resemble cuneiform or hieroglyphics. Its foundational crops were millet and rice rather than wheat and barley. Its metalworking traditions, its philosophical systems, its structures of government, none of it reads as a copy of something imported from somewhere else. The genetic evidence coming out of Fudan University and its partner institutions over the past several years does not really overturn that archaeological picture so much as confirm it in the most direct way science can, at the level of the DNA itself. The ancestors of well over 1 billion people living in China today were not living somewhere else and then arriving as conquerors or colonists. They were farming millet along the banks of the Yellow River more than 6,000 years ago, developing their own agricultural system, their own early symbols, and their own social organization, growing a civilization up out of its own soil. This also helps explain something historians have puzzled over for a long time: why Chinese civilization, unlike so many of the other great ancient societies, never experienced a true final collapse. Egypt cycled through repeated periods of fragmentation and foreign rule. Mesopotamian civilization fractured into competing states and eventually faded from the map entirely. Rome fell apart and was never reassembled in its original form. China went through its own cycles of division and reunification too, dynasty after dynasty rising and falling, but the underlying civilization as a whole never truly disappeared, and now genetics gives us at least part of an explanation for why. The population itself never fully disappeared either. The people farming the Yellow River Basin today are, in a very real biological sense, direct descendants of the people farming that same land thousands of years earlier. And that kind of deep, unbroken continuity builds a different kind of resilience, a continuity of language, of knowledge, and of tradition passed down along an almost unbroken biological thread. It is the kind of civilization built to absorb a hit and keep moving forward rather than shatter completely. None of this means China's genetic story is simple or uniform, and it would be a mistake to treat it that way. The idea of one single, perfectly uniform Han Chinese genetic identity is really more of a cultural and political concept than a strict biological reality. What the research actually paints is closer to a spectrum, a single deep ancestral trunk rooted in the ancient Yellow River farmers, with different amounts of regional blending layered on top depending on geography, migration history, and thousands of years of local adaptation. And yet, even accounting for all of that internal variation, researchers studying population genetics across East Asia have repeatedly noted that people from northern China and people from southern China tend to be genetically closer to one another, on average, than people from northern Europe are to people from southern Europe. A striking statistic, given the sheer size of the territory and the population involved. That is what more than 6,000 years of relative genetic stability actually looks like when you measure it directly in the genome. The research is still ongoing, and every new excavation adds another piece to a picture that keeps getting richer rather than simpler. Teams are now pushing further back in time and further outward in geography, sequencing genomes from sites along the Yellow River Bend that reveal long-distance interactions stretching from the Central Plains all the way to the steppe and down into southern China, tracing exactly how and when different regional populations first came into contact. Each new study adds resolution to the same underlying story, a founding population that took root along one river system more than 7,000 years ago, expanded outward over the following millennia, absorbed the people it encountered rather than erasing them, and somehow held on to its core genetic identity through famine, invasion, and the rise and fall of dynasty after dynasty. That is not just a fascinating detail buried inside a genetics journal. It is one of the clearest biological records of long-term human continuity ever recovered. A direct, traceable line running from a handful of Stone Age farmers on the banks of the Yellow River to the more than 1 billion people who carry their DNA today, still living, in large part, on the very same land where that story began.